Leaderful Church. We have a whole lot of concepts about leaders. We admire them, we denigrate them, we throw stuff at them. We, in most instances, pay them quite a lot for their leadership abilities. And we tend also to push people into leadership activities. Leadership is something into which people are often thrust by people who do not wish to take responsibility for themselves. There's all sorts of pathologies about leadership which you're familiar with. But I'm going to start, the pattern for what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start with a little bit about the concept of leaderful church and leaderful organizations, because some people will find it new. And then I'm going to weave that on into my own particular area and the area in which our interest has gone in recent years, about the role of stories and storytelling in leadership, and the fact that you, every one of you, and I, are both stories and storytellers, and that we do not understand the human being until we think of ourselves as stories. That's roughly, I mean, I could stop there in a sense, because that's actually where I'm going with this. So the slide I have up there now is a picture of Joe Raylin's book, which, as far as I'm aware, was the first use of the word leaderful. Joe was the American editor of the academic journal Management Learning when I was the overall editor, and so Joe and I used to work together quite a lot. He had this particular emphasis. I think it was 2003 was the publication date of the book, which was developing a whole lot of thinking which had been going on about wider activities of leadership, into the idea that actually, just who is it that you know who is not a leader? Who is it who doesn't have some kind of leadership activity? And I'm going to now fill that out a little bit. So, the opposite, possibly, would be this, which is a picture of a reality TV star next to Kim Kardashian. And I think that this perfectly epitomizes non-leaderfulness. That if I try to think what it is that gets up my nose so much about the Donald, it is the fact that he thinks he can do it all. I am the man, I am the centre, and my leadership is what you've elected me for, isn't it? So you shut up and go away. So that's the opposite of leaderful. And I have a quote here from Margaret Wheatley, who many of you will have come across in the area of complexity, who is a fabulous writer on leadership. I'm sad to report that in the last few years, ever since uncertainty became our insistent 21st century companion, leadership has taken a great leap backwards to the familiar territory of command and control. Her point is about uncertainty. When people are uncertain, they reach for strong leaders. Germany of the 1930s is a nice example. Brexit would be another example, and Trump is another example. If people are uncertain, they reach for strong and possibly thoroughly toxic leaders. Not that I would make a judgment about that myself, you understand. So I'm going to start with a definition. Leadership is imagining, willing, and driving, and thereby making something happen which wasn't going to happen otherwise, with the normal sort of humility you expect from an academic. It is, of course, my own. And I wouldn't write that now quite. I think the word making something happen is wrong, for reasons that those of you who are into complexity will appreciate. It should be enabling, something like that, enabling something to happen. We don't make things to happen. That is an identity confusion between ourselves and the Almighty. Okay? We enable things to happen. So that's, if we're happy with that as a definition of leading, then please note one or two things. Firstly, that leadership there is an activity, not a post. A leadership role is a slightly strange phrase. Leadership is something which people do. Leading is an activity. Leadership as something you get promoted to. There are an awful lot of people in big companies who have their high positions as a result of having never led anything. Okay? They've kept their noses clean, they've done nothing terribly surprising, and so they're safe to get into a high position. Does that ring bells? No? So leadership is an activity, not a position. There are several different activities involved. Imagining, willing, and driving was in the definition. So there's thinking of something which might happen, there's actually having the willpower to push something along, and then there's having the sheer tolerance of tedium to make sure it gets finished by driving it through. The chances of those three things being supplied by the same person are close to zero, I would suggest. So you're probably going to need different people to lead on those. We also may need more leadership, particularly in times of uncertainty and times when things are confusing, than any one person can give. And the image I have of this, which I just have to act out for you, I can't think of another way of doing it, is that leadership works well when people step forward into leading and then step back out of leading so that someone else can step forward. And if you're stuck in the forward position, you need help, okay? Because if you're stuck in the forward position of always having to lead, then frankly it's about you. It's not about what you're trying to do or what you're trying to achieve. However, there is a great industry of things like high-performance leadership. Riding a motorcycle and juggling lots of balls is obviously something we all aspire to do, but it's the kind of image you get in this, that leaders are super people. That one hasn't come across terribly well as a slide. It's a picture of Warren Bennis, and the bit I really want you to focus on is his eyes, if you can see his eyes from where you are, because it's very typical of a lot of leadership books. He's looking into the far distance, and that's what leaders can do, you know. They can look into the far distance and see what's happening there. Isn't that wonderful? Wow, that really deserves a lot of pay, doesn't it? So that's what he's doing there, and it's a typical leadership image. Or it's carrying the world on your back, feeling that you have to carry the world on your back, that you are actually appointed as saviour to those around you. Or it's the outside management development type effect. Now, as Sue said, my job used to be at Cass Business School, where I was the head of the management faculty, and so you can imagine my MBA students included lots of people from the finance sector, and the question from them was, and is the best potential leader the one who sits closest to the edge? And if you need an explanation of the 2008 crash, that's it. Okay? That's enough. So, the question I'm raising is, are leaders special? There are lots of people being highly paid, well promoted, and receiving lots of adulation for their leadership qualities. Okay? And there are lots of them deserve it. There are also a whole lot of people making money out of developing that top group. And that is probably what I've been paid for most of my life too, so I'm a guilty party in this. So there are two groups of people here with a considerable vested interest in you thinking that leaders are a quite distinct group and that not everyone can do it. There are long-standing myths about the proportion of the population which can do leadership. You've probably all heard 5% or 10% quoted. If you ask in any detail where that comes from, it comes from people's imagination. It comes from a little bit of leftover fascism. It doesn't actually have any real basis, but most people who quote it don't know that. And leadership is sometimes confused with the confidence to boss people around. I had a boss of exactly that character who was dean of a business school and chair of one of the regulating bodies and a member of the House of Lords, and he reckoned that we should all appreciate him because of his leadership qualities. And perhaps we should have. But the thing is, it doesn't necessarily translate, does it? The fact that you can lead in one particular position or one particular type of activity has few implications for what happens to you somewhere else. So I have there a picture for you of a group of leaders. Because I think that the leadership of sheep is really quite important. In the notion of stepping forward and stepping back, when you step back, you do not go to sleep, do you? You are actively engaged, you're thinking about what the other person's doing, you're looking about how to support them or how to how to stop them or whatever it is, but you're active. Sheep, I think, are grossly underrated. They're very clever animals, you know. They actually, do you know, they stand on their hind legs and jump to get apples off trees. And they're quite interesting creatures. But they don't fuss around trying to look like the leader. No, I mean, maybe they haven't got the physical qualities to do that in the first place. But I think that's a sort of group of leaders. So as David Hockney said, often stepping back, you see more, don't you? So let me give one or two examples of leaders. So this is or leadership, rather. This is someone who's been very active in thought leadership until his recent death. Very, very dependent on others. Take away the technology and his friends, and you would have had no idea what he was talking about. Give him the technology and his friends, and I still had no idea what he was talking about, but a lot of people do. A lot of people actually got a lot of benefit from what he was saying. Or the guy on the left, Nelson Mandela, was a noted leader who, in his own writing, in his own account of himself, was highly dependent on the guy in the right, Walter Sisulu. So again, we have an impression of sort of this person who did it all on their own, but that's not how he saw it at all. He saw it as being important to the people around him. Or a picture of a well-known British alcoholic who is regarded as having done a lot of important leading, but he was too pissed a lot of the time. And so when you actually read what he says about it, an awful lot of the detailed stuff was done by his wife, Clemmy, who not only supported and encouraged and loved and opened the next bottle for him, she also actually told him how to manage his way through cabinet, how to deal with the politics of those around him. So even in the sort of classic leadership images, we immediately come across the idea that there's lots of other people involved. It's not just one person. I'm going into one more bit about this, and then we'll move on to the more narrative side of it. I have found Keith Grint's work extremely helpful on leadership. He wrote a book, the best one for me is one called The Arts of Leadership, in which he says that the reason why we've been studying this topic for so long and got so little distance is we keep trying to study it as if it were a science. If we could work out what to add a little bit more of, we might know what we'd get a bit more of right at the end. And it's not. It's an art. But he then goes on to say, even more interestingly, but it's not an art, it's a number of arts. And he suggests 4 arts. I've expanded it to about to more than that in later stuff, but I'll stick with his 4 for now. So there's a philosophical art of leadership. There's what sort of organisation are we? What kind of place is this? And we just heard a lovely example of that being done about Southlands. Now, what sort of place is this? What kind of institution are we? That's one of the leadership arts. Telling the story of the place, giving it an identity. So you recruit someone to your organisation. What do they want to know? What sort of place is it? Why would I come to work here? Why would I come to your church? Why would I, whatever. And then there's the fine art, which is imagining where the story might go. What happens next? Imagining a possible future, gaining and using a vision of where the future might go. Incidentally, I am working on the assumption that you're all human beings, and therefore that at times you're listening to me and at times you've wandered off onto something else. If you, at any point you lose the thread, don't worry, I tend to work in circles, so we'll be going around this circle again in a moment. His third art is, I think, extremely interesting, which is the martial art, which is, it doesn't matter how good your identity is or how good your vision is, if the photocopies don't work, you're stuffed. Now, some people describe that as management rather than leadership. To be honest, life's too short, I don't care which it is. But I'm treating it, as Grint does, as a kind of leadership. Actually making sure that the photocopies work is a really important activity in terms of things working. And most of us will have been part of organisations which we might have cared deeply about and which we gradually got more and more angry with because just nothing ever blinking well worked, did it? So it's the martial art, And there's a performance art, and quite often when you hear people talk about leadership, it's the performance art they're thinking of. Can someone stand on their hind legs and give some sort of performance which is convincing, charismatic, which makes you want to go where they're trying to point you, using symbols to engage emotions. And as I say, that's quite often treated as if it were leadership. The last dean I worked with at Cass was absolutely appalling at this. He could not do the charismatic stuff, and it didn't matter at all, because he was superb at the identity. What sort of institution is this? And he was good at taking the story forward, and he had someone with him who could do the martial art very well. And did we care that he couldn't do this? No, we didn't, because he was surrounded by people like me who loved getting up onto their hind legs and talking. So if he needed someone to do that, there were plenty of other people to whom he could delegate the get up and perform stuff. So not everybody has to do any of these. And if you think you're good at all of those, then you are deluded. Okay? None of us are. Nobody is. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. You may have some in which you're good anyhow. You may have some in which you're potentially trainable. And you may have some in which you are indissolubly crap. You know, it's just not going to happen. But I think that the important thing for me is for us to know what we can do and what we can't, and who can do the other bits for us. I'm going to start relating this now a bit to storytelling. So the creating identity, you remember the philosophical art of leadership, is to do with why my story is different from other people's stories. What is distinctive about my story? And what characters shall I develop in the story? I'm using character here not to mean someone sort of a good human being. I'm using character like a character in a novel. What characters do I need in the story for the identity of what I want to create? Secondly, the vision of the visionary bit which came second in Grint's things, that is about developing the plot. Where are we taking the plot of this story? The story of this, say, church, use that as the example for now. The story of this church, where is it going next? So what sort of church is this? And that's number one. Number two is, and where is it going next? The organizational skill, the martial art, if nobody's paying attention to that, then nothing is going to happen, and you might as well forget your story. It is going to stall. Now, that might sound like it's just a sort of innocent activity, but no, it isn't. Because if you talk to people who are really good at the martial art, the really good chief operating officers, the really good staff officers, you'll find that they are making judgments about who to support and who to help. They are never being innocent. They are always thinking, that's what he's trying to work at, what she's got in mind there is really good. I'll actually make sure that works for them. And they put much more effort into some of us than into others of us. So it's not innocent. The organizational skill, freeing up people to focus on the story, you also free up people and influence which story they're going to focus on. And then there's charisma, which is getting people to listen to the story at all, because if the story's got a great identity, if the story has got a good plot, if the story has got the organizational stuff all dealt with, and nobody's actually listening, then you have a problem. So someone has to do that. Moving on now towards the bit about leading by story, and the notion. I'm going to relate that as a notion to Leaderful as we go along. This is the cover of the book, which Sue mentioned. You should never miss a retail opportunity, and so Vaughan has some copies for sale at a fantastically reasonable price. Elie Wiesel, as you may have come across, said that God created man because he loves a good story. We are stories. The interest to us of each other is quite often the story. As you get to know somebody, you get to know their story. You have a choice as to whether you become part of their story, maybe. But we lead storied lives. You've heard the sort of succession of ways of thinking in social sciences. So we've had economic, it's usually called man, I apologise for that, but that's the phrase historically. Economic man, socio-technical man, etc. There have been various views of the human being which have been taken over time. And the last 20 years or so in the social sciences has seen what's described as the narrative turn, that the human being is above all a creature of narrative. Homo narrans narrata, we are stories and we tell stories. So where's your life going? What's the next bit of your story? What's even between now and lunch, where's your life going? What's your story for that period of time? We are, like novelists, always developing the next part of our story. We behave in some strange ways as a result of that. People sometimes get bored with their own story and do crazy things to liven up their lives. That's called the midlife crisis. Okay? We're stories, and we need our stories to go on being interesting to ourselves to live in them. But we also tell stories. And we make choices about how to tell our own story. I'm going to use the word storytelling. This is not in any sense meant to be confused with lying. People do lie. People lie when they tell stories sometimes, just like they lie with statistics sometimes. Let's assume that on the whole people are wanting to tell the truth as they see it. So storytelling does not imply lying, but we have a choice. If you think of the way you tell your mother your story and the way you tell someone at work your story, it won't be the same. And it's not because you're lying to either of them, it's because you've got two different audiences and you tell different stories. You tell a story which you think is going to be interesting to someone, is going to be illuminating to them, is going to be in some way helpful to them. It's a personal activity. We make choices about how we tell our story. We all now, I would suggest, or you all now, everyone's doing a very good job of appearing to listen. I'd point out anybody who wasn't, obviously. Everyone's doing a very good sort of noddies of yes, but sometimes when we do that, we're actually thinking, I mustn't forget to buy the butter on the way home, while still appearing to listen. But the other thing which we're all also doing is when you come to an event like this, you don't just listen for yourself, you also think about how you're going to tell other people the story of this event. Okay? So what was the SWF conference like? Oh, well, what happened was, and you're preparing the story, but you're doing it now, aren't you? You know, so you're already working on that. It's like when someone talks to you, you are listening to them. Yeah, right. You're also doing lots of other things, like thinking about the clever thing you're going to say next, or the question you're going to ask next, or how you're going to tell the story to someone else. So we multi-track on our stories and prepare our stories the whole time. We rehearse, edit, and improve stories. So something funny happens in a meeting, and driving home that night, you think about it, and you think about how to tell the story about it. And then, if they're unlucky, you tell your partner that story back at home, and you see how it goes. And sometimes as you tell the story, you think, that didn't sound quite right. I've mistold that somehow, and it may be that you think you've misrepresented what happened, or it may be that you think you've misrepresented yourself, and you sounded nastier than you think you are, or something like that. So you edit the story. You gradually improve the story. You don't keep telling the story the same way the whole time. Is that true? If you do, incidentally, you become a bore. Think of anybody you've heard tell the same story in the same way, and it wasn't good news, was it? And all this, as I said, is without any untruthfulness. Quotation, we dream in narrative, we daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, we hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, review, criticize, build, learn, hate, and love by narrative. Doesn't leave much, I suppose, although I think that I'm not going to argue we do everything by narrative. For example, I think tunes are not a narrative. But an awful lot of our living is turning things into stories and retelling those stories. It's a very core activity for us. Stories are how we give meaning to life, and we live by and in stories. We are immersed in our story. if you have several hours sometime, I'll tell you the story of David Sims. Absolutely fascinating. Oh, you wouldn't want to miss that. But we all do have our story, and we're developing it. And the link between that and leadership is multiplex. Firstly, that leadership involves curating and influencing the stories being told. Curate, I know, is a grossly overused word at the moment. It's a shame, because I want to use it again. But one of the things that we do among the people that we work with is sometimes you listen to their story and you support them in it and you build them up and keep them talking. At other times, you look away, you give the non-verbals that suggest that it might be quite fun if they talked about something else. You don't support all stories equally, do you? You encourage people with some and discourage others. We curate the stories and influence the stories. Leadership involves writing ourselves into other people's stories and letting them write themselves into ours. If I'm working with a group of people, then I am trying to write myself into their story. In a very minor way, I'm trying to write myself into your story now by trying to express to you some ideas that I find exciting and helpful, and that I hope will become part of your story if they're not already. And equally, leadership involves letting other people write themselves into our story. If our story is impermeable, if I've already got all the people I need in my story, thank you very much, don't need any more, then I'm not going to be of much interest to you, because all of us want to be able to write ourselves into other people's stories, to become part of someone else's story. It's pretty close to the meaning of life, actually, is to be able to become part of someone else's story. We build characters into our stories. We build in heroes, villains, and fools. We build in all sorts of different characters. And of course, we implot ourselves in our stories. We see ourselves moving forward. We see our plots developing in our stories. We write ourselves into the stories of others. I've got a feeling that Escher graphic is not completely relevant, but I just do love it. So there you go. So, for example, let me now give you a practical example of what some of this meant for me when I was head of the management faculty in Cass Business School. The story I had continually to address with people who were coming to us either to work, either professors or teaching staff or students, is why would you want to join us, our story, rather than London Business School, Chicago, or Imperial College, or whatever? What is it about our story that is distinct? Why would it be more interesting to join our story than to join one of these other stories? And in order to do that, you paint a picture of, so what will this place be like in a few years' time? Now, none of us know the answer to that question, do we? So that has to be a creative activity a bit. Also, if this person comes to join our story, that'll change it too. So that's never just a statement of fact. That's always a statement of how you see things going, how you'd like things to go. The question which I would take them to have in mind is, why would we want to intertwine our story with yours? Let me say a little bit more about intertwining. In conferences in other places, outside the UK, I'm aware this sounds terribly British, but I think that love is intertwining of stories. So if you are in love with somebody, it means that you want to intertwine your story with theirs, or that you're comfortable to do so. Saying it sounds very British is because, so therefore, darling, would you intertwine your story with mine, is not the best chat-up line necessarily. I've not tried it, but it probably wouldn't be. But love is the intertwining of stories, where my story and your story become involved with each other. And that's also true of organizations as well as true of people. The intertwining of the story, if my story and the business school that I work for, if their stories are intertwined, then that radically affects the way I am there and how much I care about it. It's a kind of love for the organisation. So in talking to people, in trying to persuade people that it's the right place for them, I'm saying, why would they want to intertwine the stories? How will coming here develop your story? And how will you coming here contribute to our story? I'm suggesting there's no alternative to this, really. If you don't tell the story of your church, your organisation, someone else will. Okay, it's going to happen. People are going to tell stories about it. Am I happy to leave it to others? So in a university department, if I don't tell the story of my department, if my annual report isn't well filled with the story told in a way which I think is going to stick, then the competition will tell the story, or the rankings will tell the story, or the vice-chancellor will tell the story, and I don't want any of that lot at it. Okay, I want my story, so I'm going to tell my story first before they get there. For a church, equally, this could be by anybody. Do you want Sam Harris or George Carey to have the right to tell the story of how the church is going? Or do you want what's going on in the church? I don't. The story is rarely neutral. It can be more or less attractive and more or less enlivening. Now, I'm going to, so that you know how long you have to attend for now, I've got 3 areas that I want to dip into fairly briefly, which are, the stories have many contributors, and this is why it is so important with the leaderful aspect, that audiences matter, which is also important for the leaderful bit, and that stories, sadly, don't march in line. They're badly behaved stories, that they do things you're not expecting. So stories have many leaders. You know, the family story about what happened, so you're all gathered together at Christmas, and someone reminisces about how Grandpa once took his bicycle to pieces. Now, you've all heard this story before, and you know that at some stage it's got to get to the punchline, which is that he never managed to get it back together again. But you know it, you've heard the story, but different members of the family come in and tell bits of the story. Is that familiar to everybody? Get a multi-authoring of a story. And it's not just in families, that also happens in organisations, that different people tell bits of the story. It's not often that you get one person telling the whole story, because in order to tell the whole story, you have to get a position like this, to be standing on a stage and to have a sort of implicit position that everyone's going to shut up for a bit. And that's rare. People join the narrative rather than follow the leader. Very interesting concept. Ken Parry, who died sadly quite recently, which I think is a really useful concept. Think how people follow. What are they following? Quite often it's a story. We think of following as going with leaders. It isn't necessarily. If there's a story that excites you and you start wanting to intertwine with it, then that's what happens. We can appear in or write ourselves into... we think we've done enough intertwining in them, haven't we? Let's leave the intertwining. Stories need warranting. This got this idea originally from an academic in the folklore department in Cork, and the Irish example was his example was you get a lot of stories in Ireland warranted with "it was a priest that told me," and then okay, it's got to be true, hasn't it? But often when you're telling a story, you give something as to why people should believe your version of the story. And there are stories, there are regionally and rightly stories. Some stories, sometimes someone's telling you a story, and it sort of invites you to jump in. Recognize this? It invites you to jump in and start telling a bit of the story, or to join in the story. Other people tell you a story in such a way that you'd better be passive. You're expected to sit there and listen to it. See, if you recognize that, Barthes uses it with rightly actually meaning something which invites you to get in there and write it with them, more positive. People respond more, are changed more by writerly stories than by readerly stories. Make it passive, sit them there and tell them the story, and they won't actually be as influenced by it as they will if they can join in. Audiences matter. Usually we rehearse before we get to an audience. So I actually read my slides through before coming here this morning. Sadly, I got the wrong version of this. The version I had on my phone was a bit out of date, but I sort of rehearsed. When you're about to tell someone a story, you're going to see your annual appraisal, say, where you have to tell the story of what you've been doing in the year, or the job interview, where you have to tell the story which explains how it's extraordinary. Everything I've done so far leads naturally to this job. And you think those stories through in your mind, you rehearse it in your mind. Audiences are part of the co-creation. You've actually been very supportive to me. You've given me lots of things which make me feel that this is going okay. You could sit there and freeze me out. Please don't experiment with that. But you know what I mean. There are audiences which can freeze you out, and you freeze up in response to it. The audience is quite powerful. What stories go down well here? What sort of stories we like? What myths are nurtured? And the audience, in a way, becomes one of the co-authors, sometimes of the story, that you say something. For example, in the job interview, where you're talking about your life, and someone gives you a lot of support in one of the particular things you're saying, and so you probably go on a bit longer about that, you tell them some more about it. And so the audience becomes a co-author. And as I say, stories don't march in line. They are really badly behaved. They do what they want. The concept of narrative arc in narrative studies is that a story never goes in a straight line. That's boring. If you think of a novel, there has to be, things have to go wrong. Things cannot proceed by the shortest possible distance. Too dull. Stories, this is part of Parry's research again, stories that give convincing hope are passed on. So what's the pass-on value of your stories? Ones which give hope are passed on. Now, those who proclaim a gospel, that's good news. Okay? The stories that give hope are passed on. Although my question, not to this audience in particular, but my question as someone who has sat in many pews many times, is whether the stories that are being told necessarily do give hope. Stories are hard for hierarchies to control. Hierarchies don't necessarily like stories. The stories will be told around about what's happened in this part of the organisation, whether you like it or not. That can be pretty deflating to the egos of people in hierarchies. So if I do something really stupid now, you will tell stories about it, and that's sort of embarrassing. So that's a way of controlling hierarchy. Stories behave as if they have a life of their own. I don't know how to control whether a story gets passed on. I know some things that influence it, but the story will develop. And there's a sense in which the stories around us are telling us as much as we're telling them. Who we are is affected by that story. So what does all that tell us? My question is, how story-filled are our churches? Yes, there is a typo there, it should have been 2 words. How story-filled are our churches? Who is telling the stories? It's not just someone from the front. Everybody in a church is telling a story. As you know, go around and talk to the little old lady who never said anything before, and she's usually got a really interesting story. Are the stories multi-authored? Yeah, you bet they are. Are the stories ones where people start contributing and other people contribute bits? Are other people invited to be characters in the stories? How much activity is available to anybody? Is someone invited not just to be, how nice to see you, do come and sit over there, but are they invited to be a character in a story? Are other people trusted as co-narrators? And are they invited to intertwine their stories? I'm not talking about it now, but the notion that people that love is what makes any organisation work better. That intertwining is really critical. So the implications for leading for that are the stories that your church lives in make it. The stories lived in an organisation make the future of the organisation. Individually or collectively, we can all get bored with our own story and need to liven it up sometimes. And stories can wear out. This is quite a new concept to me, actually. I came across it in a paper I was referring a few weeks ago. Stories can wear out. It needs refreshing. It needs something new about it. If you've told it too many times, you're no longer interested. So I'm arguing that the Leaderful Church is story-filled, and you'll understand it better, and that we will work with it better if it's story-filled. This is a Patek Philippe advert. It's the prints a bit small. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. It says you merely look after it for the next generation. And I think the same is true of stories. You never own a story. You look after it for the next generation. You contribute to its telling. That's the most we ever invited to do. We make guest appearances in stories, which are often memorable. You help to curate it. You become part of living it. You welcome the other stories. And if your story isn't changing, then you're in trouble. That's actually called death, isn't it? If your story isn't changing. Or maybe, actually, that's not even fair there, is it? Because actually, even death doesn't necessarily stop your story changing. But if your story has been the same for a long time, then you should get out more. Sue mentioned at the beginning about people with talking about objects that they sort of they just quite like to somehow reflected this, and I've got two which are on the next two slides. This one I've chosen because I think the painting is beautiful, but also because this is a story. This is a picture of two people leading, I think the picture is so often painted and so often looked at and so often thought about. So who's leading? Would that be the helpless baby? Would that be the young woman? What exactly is going on there? This is an early moment in the most fantastic story. So that's one object. And my other object is that, because I think the implication of the need that we have for other people in our stories is that All Saints is a great concept. You need stories which involve all. And that if you're involved in something where some people's stories can be ignored, then I think we should be worried about that. Because the organisation is Leaderful. The fact that it's a brewing company was just a happy accident. Thank you very much.